Let's bring in our guests. There we are. We are joined with Arnaud Develay. He is an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in in defense of former President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, in the wake of the Caesar Act. He documented illegal sanction regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of American Political Consensus. Arnaud, welcome to the show, man. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
I'm doing fine, Jamal. Thank you for your invitation and your gracious introduction.
No, man, thank you for joining me. I looked you up when I made contact with you. I want to thank Jeremy for this contact, and I really appreciate you joining me on this. I have been fascinated by the collective freak out that has been taking place since Trump has gotten into office. And part of that freak out has to do with his point of view on this issue of Ukraine. Basically, we need to stop these wars. Now, Biden, in fact, I'm going to show you this. I want to get your take on this. This is Blinken recently, because again, from their point of view, Trump said he's going to end the war. Zelensky is somewhat freaked out because he's going to end the war. Joe Biden's project that has been taking place over the last several years is coming to an end potentially. Blinken, despite losing the election, meaning the issue of Ukraine was litigated in the election with Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris and Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. They lost that. And even when you ask people, who do you trust more so in foreign policy, Donald Trump came up higher than Kamala Harris. Like I said, this was litigated. Despite it being litigated, this was Blinken. I believe this was yesterday.
That Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend Ukraine. As we're working to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself, the United States continues to step up. We've obligated just recently and pushed out the door another $8 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. That was in September. Another almost $500 million just a few weeks ago. And President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th.
No, it's not going to matter. I mean, all things being equal, the American public effectively said, we're sick of this war. I mean, by virtue of electing Trump. And Joe Biden is still saying, we're going to give every dollar that we have at our disposal. We're going to get billions. We're going to get billions out the door before Trump gets in. Is it going to matter that they get that money? And, well, let's ask that one first. And then I want to move to the next point first. But give me your take on this. Is any of this money going to make a difference in the grand scheme of things from the standpoint of the war?
Well, to make a long story short, no, it's not going to make any difference at all whatsoever. For the simple reason that Ukraine, or what's left of it, is running out of manpower to begin with. They had their shot and they miscalculated heavily. We were mostly in presence of an informational war, to be sure, from the get-go.
Yeah.
And all the military development on the ground were carefully obstructed from the not only the American public but the Western public at large. It's interesting that you showed this clip from departing Secretary of State Blinken, bearing on throwing more money to the problem. Since this morning, there was a clip made on the train back from Brussels to Paris by a French politician,
yeah,
who understands very well the Ukraine situation as well. And he was trying to basically sensitize the French public this time that just as you mentioned, Donald Trump was invested with a mandate, at the very least, to put an end to this money laundering operation, was explaining to the French people that in their back, something close to 12.8 billion euros was being sent to Ukraine, even though the French economy is teetering on the verge of collapse. We might be facing a takeover, in terms of what happened in Greece back in 2010, this time for France. And that we're being told by the Prime Minister, who used to be an EU commissioner himself, so he's kind of an insider. that we need to cut down on spending, and this implies cutting down on Medicare, healthcare, which, coincidentally, is 10 billion euros.
Wow.
So there you have it. So it's a problem, of course, in Washington, but it's also a problem in Brussels. And in the wake of Trump, what we're seeing is actually a doubling down on some of those usual suspects, i.e. Macron and Starmer, which we found out this past Monday were angling to try to get sleepy Joe Biden to approve the use of ATACMS, long-range missile system, deep into Russian territory,
Right.
which, as we know, is a red line, a major red line at that. So when somebody said that those next 65, 67 days now left until inauguration, probably, arguably, the most dangerous period of these past 2.5 years, 3.5 years, you have to take it very seriously. Those people they don't want it to end. Everybody, I mean, some of those people, most of them involved in the Project Ukraine are making out with a huge loot. And to the extent some of them are getting the memo, quote unquote, it's interesting to look at the cryptocurrencies basically jumping up on the graphics, because it shows that, I'm not saying this is the essentially the sole reason for the uptick, but a lot of people are trying to evacuate the loot from Ukraine, and crypto is the method they're using.
Wow. I mean, we spent nearly $300 billion. So I would imagine if it was a leaky bucket, that's a lot of, pennies that are falling from that bucket. Give me your take on, going back 2 years ago, I made this point in saying that Russia went in with 150,000 troops and were able to take 20% territory. And they were able to effectively win every battle, even though they didn't have enough manpower in order to kind of push further. And my reasoning on that was, Ukraine is going to lose this. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people dead, 20% territory gone. And I remember back then I asked a very basic question: what was it for? And I'm going to ask you that. What was all of this for? There were the Minsk agreements, 1 and 2. There were Istanbul agreements, both of which would have ended the conflict, all of which were tossed to the side. What was all of this death, carnage for? Give me your take on this.
Well, I would say in one word, hubris. I think a lot of people in the State Department, for whatever reason, we're not going to get into the psychology of those people, but they really internalized the very notion that the Russians were basically not up to the task, and that NATO would basically use Ukraine as a battering ram,
right,
and implement the RAND paper that was released in summer 2019, which bore on undermine entire Russian capacities at its borders, including Syria, including Ukraine, but also including the Caucasus. So, we're dealing with people who basically do not allow alternate viewpoints, and so you create an echo chamber, and this reinforces the cognitive bias. And in the end, basically, when they started being confronted to enforcing development, they kept doubling down. This is what happens with the people we have, whether they are in NATO or in Brussels at the EU level. We're dealing with ideologues and not really pragmatics and realist people.
Right.
Problem is, they never want to engage in self-introspection and call into question some of the prejudice that informs their opinion about how the world works. And so, bearing on this fundamental premise, what we have is a bunch of people who somehow are in denial and consider that the problem ought to be dealt with by throwing money at it or by doubling down on sending any kind of weapon system, hoping, doing the same thing and hoping for a different result, which some might have said that it is the very definition of insanity. And I guess this is where we are now.
So all of this was purely done for geopolitical expansion. Like, all of this talk about it, an unprovoked war, all of that is nonsense. All of this was effectively done purely because the West believe Ukraine can be a pivot point for Russia. We can put it on the border, and Russia can't do anything to stop us from doing so. They effectively believe their own propaganda.
Yes, it has something to do also with the Russophobia, that we've been experiencing the last few years, to be sure, the last 2.5, 3 years, in proportion that are completely wild. Anything that bears on Russian culture, Russian contribution, Russian music, Russian composers, Russian writers is, has been up to now at least cancelled. And so this idea that people who are running Russian Federation and obviously are concerned about the security and well-being of their populations would have somehow admissible claims to wanting to have security concerns addressed. This is somehow considered like some kind of antinomics in Washington. Like, those people are not human beings. We don't look at them as human beings, as sentient, thinking people who are entitled to have their own viewpoints being taken into account. Therefore, to get around this problem, this expression of alternate viewpoints, you basically throw ad hominem arguments at them, and you try to basically deny them their very humanity. And this is a very dangerous perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you. They don't see it. There's no ability to look at it from the other person's point of view. And I'm assuming that's just political, right? It's not about right or wrong. For example, if Russia knocked over the government of Mexico, if they put in weapons, intelligence services, if they had all of these spies and whatnot in order to gin it up and get it angry, if they built up a military on the border of the U.S., I don't believe for a moment that the U.S. will say, well, Mexico is an independent country, it can do whatever it wants. And I don't believe for a moment that any of them would accept that premise. And yet Russia's supposed to accept it on the border of Ukraine. The thing that shocked me more than anything else about this, though, was the willingness of Europe to take pain for this project. For example, the German government has just collapsed. Scholz is going to have elections coming up, and it collapsed over this issue of giving money to Ukraine. As you pointed out, France has a deficit in and of itself. Now, these are two of the powerhouses of Europe. I mean, the populations can't be okay with this. Like, they can't be okay with this. It's hearing Annalena Baerbock arguing that they had to cut government services so they can give money to Ukraine is outrageous. What is going on domestically in Europe over this issue? And is there, let's say, agitation and a pushing against governments for going in this direction with this project?
Well, to be sure, people are feeling the pinch right now economically, and everybody knows that one of the main reasons why the situation is getting increasingly worse day by day is that all the money is going to Ukraine. But the problem is, in as far as France is concerned, we're not, seemingly we're not seeing any coordinated attempt. We may have like occasional protest organized on Saturdays, when people are off on the weekend. But what you would need is some kind of
like a yellow vest,
taking a permanent 24/7 until the government backs down. And for the time being, we're not seeing this. So I guess the assumption is that there's still enough food in the fridge. Wow. And there's still enough games and circus to be to be looked at. And so for now, everything seems to be still okay.
What is the current
we'll see.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. What's the current status on the ground in Ukraine, by the way? It's moved off the pages of the front pages, and I'm assuming it's off the front pages because, well, they're losing. And it's pretty much instantiated in the West at this point that Ukraine is losing. I mean, hell, we have articles where they're saying the front has collapsed. So this idea of a stalemate is out the window. What's the current status in the battlefield, on the ground in Ukraine, in the war?
Well, the Russian armed forces are eking out a new territorial gain day after day. They're just going about it very methodically.
Yeah.
Obviously, not wanting to espouse the shock and awe, U.S. Way of doing things. They're gonna have to live with those people after all, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
So, but for the time being, the Ukrainian armed forces, or what's left of it, are not really engaging the Russians in a way that we've seen, let's say, in Avdiivka or in Bakhmut. They are basically abandoning their positions, and basically the Russians are just creating new cauldrons everywhere they can, isolating the Ukrainian armed forces, and slowly but surely approaching a situation where if they take Prokrovsk, they will capture the hub of logistical hubs that allows supply lines to keep functioning. So this is where we want to be looking at now. This town called Prokrovsk. Once that falls, they'll be able to pretty much, I wouldn't say starve, but the main settlements of Kupiansk and Kramatorsk. And this is the beginning of the end, because then we could be looking at this coming winter, depending on what will happen on the diplomatic front with the incoming Trump administration. But in thus far as, it's a two-leg system. So diplomacy is only as successful as it produces results. If the fundamental premise is predicated on freezing the conflict and allowing elements to be put into place so that 20 years down the road, we're back at it, Russia is not going to settle for this. They may decide to basically unleash the full power of their armed forces on the whole front and capture Kiev, because let's forget about it. It's all about denazification and demilitarization. It's very simple. Russia.
I see.
So they will not allow even like some kind of cosmetic change to take place, whereas Zelensky is replaced by someone even more, I would say, Nazi. It's out of the question.
Okay, no, that's super interesting, because it sounds like you're saying it's something. Okay, let me ask this in two ways. First, with Europe, and then I want to bounce back to Trump for a bit. But how is Europe dealing with this notion that Donald Trump is coming back? I mean, they were terrified of him winning the election. I mean, it was obvious. I mean, some of the comments that people were making in Europe was just outrageous. From your, do you think that if Trump does pull out, that Europe can cover the gap? Meaning, is Europe going to be left holding the bag on the issue of Ukraine?
Well, Europe is basically in a situation of its own doing. I mean, European elites, to be sure. And to the extent the Americans are basically calling it off, the EU elites are left on the hook. And they already said that they would provide, they would fill in the gap in terms of financing. So it's almost like they.
Do you really believe they
well,
can do that?
There are talks about grabbing those $300 billion frozen Russian funds. So yeah, they're down serious about it. But in the end, reality will dictate whether or not this is a suitable policy. And for now, they have to be showing until the Biden administration is officially out of office. They have to give reassurances that they're still on the program. But by the time the Trump administration comes in, I'm betting we are going to see a different sound emanating from Brussels, and we can count on Orban and Robert Fico from Slovakia to somehow lead the charge in trying to deviate the EU packbot.
Okay. Yeah, well, they hate Orban and they hate Fico. But like you said, that may change when Trump come in. I'm curious from the other angle. Do you think Trump is really going to follow through with it? Or do you think the blob is going to, change Trump's point of view? For example, Putin said one day, he said, when the president wins a race, there's a man in a black suit that comes in and effectively says, this is the way things are done. Now, Trump seems to be bucking that trend in the people that he's appointing for these positions. I mean, he just appointed Tulsi Gabbard for DNI. Tulsi Gabbard just put out a video saying that Ukraine needs to be a neutral country. So I guess my question is, do you think Trump is really going to follow through with what he's been saying in regards to ending the war? And I agree with you. Russia is not going to accept any ending of the war with the exception of on their terms. Like, I don't know what Trump has nothing at his disposal in real terms, short of going to some kind of major war with Russia, which would just be a complete bastardization of anything he said during the campaign. So assuming for the moment that they're legitimate on this, I guess my thing is there's some people who don't believe Trump is going to do this, that he's going to continue to give some money to Ukraine. Maybe the better question is, how do you think he would go about ending this if he does go through with ending this?
Well, it all depends how much obstacle they've put in his path by the time he takes office on January 28th, which is still some quite away from now. For the time being, we have this congressional provision inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act of 2024, which basically prevents any future president from calling into question the membership of the US into NATO. So this is an interesting aspect, keeping in mind that the president basically can decide to opt out of any kind of treaty. It doesn't need to be somehow bounded. There's a constitutional question here, to be sure. But one could think that the Supreme Court would basically wash its hands by saying it's a political question and the executive branch has complete latitude to opt out. So bearing on that, there's the issue of the financing from NATO member states. And Trump is going to probably use that card to de facto create a rift, which will, make somewhat neutralize or at least slow down NATO's programs for, the foreseeable future. We'll be hearing, to be sure, voices in Europe calling for a European army, but with what money and with what men? That's the real question.
Well, they're doing it now. Macron has been doing it for a while. I mean, he pointed out, if this is going to be America first, maybe we should deal with our own security interests, which is not insane when you think about it. I mean, in real terms. But to be fair, I've never heard Donald Trump say anything about pulling out of NATO. If anything, he's tried to force them to pay more money.
Well, that's the way he presents it. Obviously, he can't just come right out and say we're opting out of NATO, because obviously this imperial forever war model is just not working. But to be sure, if we somewhat try to guess what goes on in his mind, which is one of a pragmatic businessman, you will want to, wind down on on your sales, and make sure that you reorient your resources in trying to catch up, if anything, on a weapon system in which you are 10 to 15 years behind. But he has to navigate, a blob that's been there for decades, that's very entrenched, and he has to really proceed cautiously, tread cautiously. So hence the reason why he appointed Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, so she can ride shotgun and prevent any kind of funny business from being pulled, while he's first, implementing, choosing his team, getting things situated, and then begin to implement some kind of policy which may bring this whole Ukraine fiasco to an end. So we'll see. Right now, it's too early to say. We know there's been talk of a senior figure to be named as special envoy to the Ukraine conflict.
I heard that. Yeah, I heard that.
We don't know who it might be. I mean, I would push for Jeffrey Sachs, but
oh man, I would love Jeffrey Sachs for that role. He's definitely experienced. He definitely has qualifications for it. He could definitely do it. Look, they say people are policy, right? And the person he puts into that role on some level is going to give some kind of context into what Donald Trump is thinking about that war. In fact, this is Tulsi Gabbard. Let me play this. I want to get your take on Gabbard's response because, again, they are screaming right now in D.C. John Bolton is losing his mind, and I love it because the people who are angry are the people who I don't like anyway. Like Rachel Maddow is screaming about this. John Bolton, Abigail Spangler. Spangler is a spook that's in Congress, basically somebody that worked for the CIA. All these people are complaining, oh my God, I can't believe that Gabbard is taking this role. Liz Cheney. I'm okay with this. They hate Tulsi Gabbard specifically because Tulsi Gabbard called out the fact that we were trying to knock over the government of Syria and got 500,000 people killed in the process. She also called out the Ukraine fiasco, as you call it, basically us knocking over the government of Ukraine and expanding NATO to the border of the country. They hate her for that. She got pushed out of the Democratic Party. It was part of that, but also part of the debate performance where she basically put a knife in Kamala Harris. But she came out, I believe this was yesterday, and she said this.
Presidents Putin, Zelensky, and Biden. It's time to put geopolitics aside and embrace the spirit of aloha, respect, and love for the Ukrainian people by coming to an agreement that Ukraine will be a neutral country, no military alliance with NATO or Russia, and therefore alleviate the legitimate security concerns of both US and NATO countries as well as Russia, because there'd be no Russian or NATO troops on each other's non-Baltic borders. This would allow the Ukrainian people to live in peace. Aloha.
Would Putin take that? Or would Russia or Moscow take that position? Because effectively what that sounds like is this is what Russia's argument, right? You guys are expanding to our border. You've knocked over the government of Ukraine, and now you've put a ton of military on our border. This is unacceptable. Would that be acceptable as a position to start with?
Well, that sure would get people in Moscow very interested in sitting down and proceeding along those lines. I mean, this is basically what was put forward in late 2021, about a couple of months before the start of operations. There was a treaty draft which was submitted to Washington, which called for basically demilitarization of Ukraine, calling for that country to remain neutral and not be absorbed by NATO. And, that was a pretty simple proposition, but this was rejected out of hands. So to the extent, Tulsi Gabbard, is promoting what has been known to be acceptable for the leadership in Russia. Mm-hmm. We can only hope that she manages to press this issue on some of the most entrenched interests in Washington.
Yeah.
But as long as you have people like Newland at NED, she's still there. I mean, she might have resigned from her position as number 3 in state, but she's still there. We still have a lot of people in there. So I would somehow submit that you need to first cleanse all those federal agencies before you begin to contemplate initiating a policy on steady ground.
Yeah.
That's really the challenge here.
See, that's always the thing, right? How much power does a president have in the context of the system that the president is in? What do you think of Trump appointments up to this point? If you had to think of any kind of like a foreign policy, for example, apparently it was released yesterday that Elon Musk met with the envoy ambassador, and they were having a conversation about bringing down hostilities in Iran. Now, that is fascinating when you think about it, because if you think about the people who Trump put into his administration, many of these people are hawks. I mean, you're talking about Marco Rubio, Hegelev, like these people are, bomb first, ask questions later. And yet there's this kind of odd propensity among some of the people, let's say like a RFK Jr. or a Tulsi Gabbard, that pulls against that instinct. How do you view the people that he's put in his administration up to this point? And by the way, I'm including Elon Musk into this because it seems like Musk has very much influence.
Well, Musk is a very fascinating personage, to be sure. But to the extent he practices public diplomacy, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all remember how Dennis Rodman used to pal around with the leader of North Korea 20 years ago, and somehow contributed to setting the stage for high-level meetings. So you never want to underestimate the power of public diplomacy, and Musk is an innovator in that sense. He's someone who thinks out of the box, and we need people who think out of the box. I'm not saying he's 100% right on every single issue. Far
Yeah,
from
of
it.
course.
I still recall what he said about Bolivia.
That's right.
We'll coup you if we need your lithium. But to the extent this is what we have, in Washington right now, Washington needs a spring cleaning. We need new thinking, bold thinking. We need to take into account that there's no going back to the unipolar world. This is a done deal, and we need to take into account that there's three major poles of geopolitical power now. And the US is perfectly able to somehow exploit the situation to its benefit if it takes into account that there's a new game in town now. But the US still had a lot of, I would say, assets, and it's respected for many more things. It's innovation, it's energy, it's vitality, it's inventiveness, its ability to think out solutions when older societies are more encrusted. And so, I believe that there's possibilities, but we have to first take act that some people have to go.
Let me ask you this.
They've been found out.
So one of my subscribers, he's asking a really good question. So as I pointed out when we first started, Russia had the Minsk agreements, 1 and 2. They had the Istanbul agreements. And all things being equal, before this conflict started, Putin, I always described him as like a preacher begging for people to come to Jesus. He is standing out saying, we need security guarantees. We need security guarantees. The situation is untenable for us. Meaning he was trying to make another deal to stop the conflict before it ever started. And the West just did not want to have any conversation about it. Could he even trust the deal that the West will come up with? Meaning, even if Donald Trump wanted to have a deal, let's say he was legitimately wanting to end the war, how could Russia trust any deal that the U.S. comes up with? If you look at the JCPOA, they got rid of that. If you look at the Minsk agreements, they got rid of that. And with the Minsk agreements, there was this extra special bonus where Merkel comes out and said, we lied. We lied intentionally in order to ensure Ukraine can build up a military. So a bill or treaty that was supposed to stop a war was used to give time for Ukraine to build up a military to provoke a war. How on earth could Moscow trust anything that comes out of the U.S. on any deal that is made or signed? Give me your take on that.
Well, obviously, trust has been undermined by years and years of broken promises, and the Russians are not naive enough to think that whatever deals emerges out of future negotiation, you have to take the Americans' words for it. But you gotta somehow give it a shot. That's the alternative is unthinkable. So you have to give a chance to diplomacy for diplomacy to work, and you have to basically at some point try to develop a relationship with somebody who is going to be representing the other side's interest. But you want to, as Reagan used to say, trust but verify.
But verify. I guess my question is, how do you verify that situation? Like, how do you, like, for example, they stop the conflict. Russia gets to the Dnieper, Trump gets in, and they say, okay, Ukraine is going to be a neutral country. Okay, great. How do you ensure that Ukraine remains a neutral country? I mean, look at Taiwan. Taiwan is a really good example. You had the one China policy. The U.S. says, we believe in the one China policy. And yet they fill Taiwan up with every weapon, gun, bullet that they can find and get their hands on. I guess my thing is, how would a country like Russia ensure that Ukraine remains neutral, regardless of any treaty or deal that the U.S. signs? It's that part that I don't quite get.
Well, I would surmise that if we ask the opinion of the Ukrainian people after 2.5 years of slaughter, what it is that they want, they would opt out for the end of any kind of hostilities and
Yeah.
the end of being instrumentalized by any kind of any bloc. So what we would want to do is, this is my take on it, but we could organize elections which are organized and coordinated jointly by Moscow and Washington, so that there's no room left for second guessing the outcome, and let the Ukrainian people decide. And
But the Russian
hopefully,
Federation, from their point of view, those breakaway regions are part of Russia. So the only regions that are going to be left are going to be more. Yeah, go into that for me. I mean, those regions from Russian point of view, those are Russian territory. That's Russian territory. I mean, part of any
yes.
deal is going to be that those Ukrainian soldiers leave, move out. So, okay, let me ask this in a
Go
different
home,
way.
I would say.
Yeah, go home. Effectively, go home.
Which is basically what they want. I mean, they're being rounded up in the streets now. So I think they just want to go home. They understand deep down inside that it's over. There's
Yeah.
nothing to do. You don't want to die for BlackRock.
Well, I imagine it's extremely demoralizing. I mean, you've been fighting all of these years. You have lost territory. You've lost hundreds of thousands of human beings, and the U.S. said we're with you for as long as it takes. And then a new president gets in. Europe gets tired of paying the money for it. The German government collapses, and you realize, okay, for as long as it takes, it's going to be not very long. I would imagine it's very demoralizing if you're a Ukrainian soldier in this case. From your point of view, how do you think this ultimately ends, though? What does it look like when it ends? Is it a partition? Does Russia have to take all of Ukraine? Is it, how do you think this basically ends? It resolves itself?
Well, I mean, like you said, those former eastern region of Ukraine are not going back.
Right.
This is a done deal. This was done. They had a chance. Kiev had a chance to show itself to be a responsible legal authority over those regions, and they basically treated them like second-class citizens. So the trust is fundamentally broken forever, and those people have decided they've exercised their right under UN Charter Article 1 to basically turn to Russia, and some would say go home.
Yeah.
And there's no going back on that. And as far as what's left of Ukraine, it all depends on the Ukrainian regime and its sponsors' ability to look at the situation for what it is and call it a day. If they don't, they are likely to lose more territories. We see that Poland is already looking to grab, a chunk of Ukraine. Hungary as well.
Do you
Romania
really think
also
do that? I've heard that argument made that those countries were looking to basically take the decapitated remains of Ukraine into its own auspices. Do you really think they do that? In fact, would Russia even allow that? I mean, Russia's made this argument that if anything goes into West Ukraine, it's fair game. I mean, that would be in war with NATO on some level, right? Or would it? I mean, give me your take.
No, because Ukraine is not part of NATO, technically. So they cannot, we cannot anticipate a situation where NATO and Russia officially, frontally comes into conflict. Nobody wants that, which is the whole point of having a proxy, to do your bidding.
Right. But if Poland goes into Western Ukraine, then Poland is technically part of the battlefield at that point. That's basically a NATO country going into Ukraine.
Well, they were going to Ukraine to essentially retrieve what they consider they've contributed to the war effort for no positive outcome. That's my take on it. And so it would be kind of what we saw with Poland in the 18th century. The country will be essentially partitioned, and there will be essentially just a district of Kiev left with all the representative, the Russian might have a presence there, the Poles, the Hungarians, and we may have some kind of a neutral, like Berlin was, this kind of this international city, that's a possibility. It doesn't have to be like this, but if we keep on the current trajectory, it's not unlikely that it would happen.
Wow. This has
So
been
I guess it's a race against time, as far as the incoming Trump administration is concerned.
I have to be honest with you. I didn't vote for Trump. I didn't feel like I had a dog in this hunt one way or the other. And so I kind of just called it balls and strikes. If nothing else, though, I hope he ends this war. Like, it's hard for me to wrap my head around 500,000 people dying for no reason, like for no good reason at all, purely because people, fat cats, decides they want to invade other countries and use our tax dollars for geopolitical expansion. Like, that's outrageous to me. And then to like cover it with all of these lies of unprovoked war. Russia is, trying to take over all of Europe, and the stuff that they've been saying over the course of these last several years. Yeah, if Donald Trump, whatever he is, if he can come in and end this war, God bless him for doing so. I'll take it. Arnaud, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate you joining me. Arnaud Develay. How do I pronounce your last name, by the way? Is it Develay?
Develay. And the first name is Arnaud.
Arnaud, thank you. Arnaud, yeah. Okay. Arnaud Develay.
No problem.
He's an international lawyer.
Thanks, Jamal.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate you joining me. He's an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in the defense of former President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanction regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of the American Political Consensus. And say what you will about Trump. Like I said, I didn't vote for him, but if he ends this war, God bless him for doing so. Thank you, Arnaud. Have a good one, man.